Marcus "Tank" Rodriguez had ruled Cell Block D at Riverside Correctional Facility for 6 years, his 280-pound frame and reputation for brutal violence maintaining an iron grip over the drug trade, protection rackets, and underground gambling that generated more revenue than most legitimate businesses. Fresh meat coming through. Tank bellowed as the steel doors clanged open to admit the latest batch of inmates, his voice echoing off concrete walls while his crew of loyal enforcers flanked him like wolves sensing wounded prey. Time to teach these fish how things work in my house. The new arrivals shuffled through in their orange jumpsuits, most avoiding eye contact with the obvious predator who controlled their new reality. But one inmate caught Tank's attention with his calm demeanor and steady gaze that suggested either stupidity or hidden strength. "You there, pretty boy," Tank snarled at the lean, dark-haired man who stood apart from the cowering group. "What's your name and what brings you to my kingdom?" The newcomer's response would prove to be the beginning of Tank's downfall, though he had no way of knowing that the unassuming man before him was Staff Sergeant David Chen, an Army Ranger with 3 tours in Afghanistan who had volunteered for the most dangerous undercover assignment of his military career. "Name's David Miller," came the quiet reply, using the cover identity that months of preparation had constructed. "And I'm just here to do my time and stay out of trouble." The humble response triggered Tank's predatory instincts, as he interpreted David's calm politeness as weakness that could be exploited for entertainment and profit. The prison ecosystem that Tank had created operated on fear, violence, and the systematic exploitation of weaker inmates who paid protection money, provided sexual services, or performed dangerous tasks in exchange for basic safety and survival necessities. "Miller, you seem like a smart guy," Tank said with false friendliness as he approached David during their first meal together in the cafeteria, his massive frame casting shadows while his crew surrounded the table to prevent escape. "But smart don't mean nothing in here if you can't back it up with muscle or money. Which one you got?" The question was a test that every new inmate faced, designed to determine their place in Tank's hierarchy of predators, prey, and useful tools for maintaining control over the prison's illegal economy. David's response reflected months of training with FBI behavioral analysts who had taught him to blend in while gathering intelligence. "I don't have much money, and I'm not looking for trouble. I just want to serve my sentence quietly and get back to my life." His deliberately meek demeanor was calculated to position him as a potential victim rather than a threat, allowing him to observe Tank's operation while avoiding the kind of confrontation that would blow his cover before he could gather the evidence needed to bring down the corruption network that extended far beyond the prison walls. "That's what I thought," Tank laughed, his amusement shared by the dozen inmates who served as his enforcers and lieutenants. "Another weak fish who thinks he can hide in the shadows until his release date. Well, Miller, hiding costs money in my establishment, and since you don't have cash, you'll be paying in other ways." The initiation ritual that Tank used to break new inmates involved calculated humiliation designed to establish dominance while identifying those who might pose future threats to his authority within the prison's unofficial power structure. "Miller, tomorrow you're going to clean my cell, wash my clothes, and make my bunk every morning before breakfast," Tank announced loud enough for surrounding tables to hear, his public declaration serving to establish David's subservient status while discouraging other inmates from offering assistance or friendship. "And every Wednesday, you're going to give me your commissary allowance to help pay for the protection services I'm providing to keep you safe from the real animals in this place." The extortion demand was standard operating procedure for Tank's organization, generating steady income while creating psychological dependence that made victims complicit in their own exploitation. David's response was carefully calibrated to appear submissive while secretly documenting the specific crimes that federal prosecutors would need to build their case. "I understand, Tank. I don't want any trouble, and I appreciate you looking out for me." His agreement seemed to satisfy Tank's ego while positioning David as a reliable source of income and labor that wouldn't require constant supervision or violent enforcement to maintain compliance. "Smart choice, fish," Tank replied with satisfaction. "Stick with me and you might just survive your sentence without too many scars or broken bones." The hidden recording devices that David carried, surgically implanted and virtually undetectable to standard prison security screenings, captured every word of Tank's criminal enterprises while his trained memory cataloged details about corruption networks that extended to guards, administrators, and outside contacts who facilitated the smuggling operations that kept Tank's empire profitable. "Johnson, did the shipment arrive with tonight's laundry delivery?" Tank asked his lieutenant during what he assumed was a private conversation in the prison workshop, unaware that David was documenting evidence of the sophisticated smuggling network that brought drugs, weapons, and contraband into the facility through compromised staff members. "Yeah, boss, everything's here," Johnson replied. "The Colombian stuff, the pills from our pharmacy contact, and those special phones that can't be detected by their scanning equipment. Captain Williams says his cut goes up to 30% starting next month, or he might have to start doing surprise inspections that could complicate our operations." The conversation revealed corruption that reached into the prison administration while documenting specific criminal activities that federal prosecutors could use to build conspiracy charges against dozens of participants in Tank's network. David's military training in intelligence gathering allowed him to memorize names, dates, amounts, and operational details that would later be crucial for dismantling the entire organization and prosecuting everyone involved in the conspiracy. The testing phase of David's undercover assignment intensified as Tank began assigning increasingly dangerous and illegal tasks designed to determine whether his new victim could be trusted with knowledge of more serious criminal activities. "Miller, I need you to deliver a package to cell 247 without letting the guards see what you're carrying," Tank instructed during David's second week, handing him a small bundle that David immediately recognized as containing drugs and possibly weapons based on its weight and shape. "If you get caught, you keep your mouth shut about where it came from, and I'll make sure your commissary account stays funded and your cell stays safe. If you talk, well, let's just say that snitches don't live long enough to enjoy their release dates." The threat was delivered with casual menace that highlighted how Tank maintained control through fear while creating loyalty through a combination of rewards and intimidation that had proven effective for years. David's response demonstrated the psychological profile his cover identity had been designed to project. "I understand, Tank. I won't let you down, and I definitely won't say anything to anyone about anything." His eager compliance seemed to convince Tank that he had found another reliable soldier for his organization, someone whose desperation for protection and fear of violence would ensure loyalty and silence about the criminal enterprise's operations. The military discipline and combat training that David had acquired through years of army service remained hidden beneath his carefully constructed facade of weakness and compliance, though he occasionally had to control reflexive responses when Tank's crew engaged in the kind of casual violence that maintained their reputation for brutality. "Miller, hold this punk while I teach him about respecting his betters," Tank ordered as he prepared to assault a young inmate who had failed to pay his weekly protection fee, expecting David to assist in the attack that would serve as an example to other potential resistors. The moment represented a crucial test of David's cover identity, as refusing to participate would expose him as either a potential threat or someone with moral principles that could complicate Tank's operations, while participating would make him complicit in assault and potentially blow his undercover mission if the violence escalated beyond what his handlers considered acceptable. "Tank, maybe we should handle this somewhere more private," David suggested, using tactical thinking to redirect the situation while maintaining his subservient persona. "The guards have been doing more frequent patrols lately, and getting caught might bring heat on all of us." His suggestion demonstrated loyalty to Tank's interests while providing an excuse to avoid immediate participation in violent crimes that could compromise his mission objectives and legal standing once his true identity was revealed. The breakthrough moment in David's intelligence gathering came when Tank, convinced of his new recruit's loyalty and usefulness, invited him to witness a meeting with corrupt prison officials who were negotiating expanded smuggling operations and protection services for Tank's criminal enterprise. "Miller, you've proven yourself useful and trustworthy," Tank said as he prepared for the clandestine meeting. "So I'm going to let you see how the real business gets conducted in this place. Keep your eyes open and your mouth shut, and you might learn something that could be profitable for both of us in the future." The invitation represented exactly the kind of access that David's mission had been designed to achieve, providing him with direct evidence of corruption at the highest levels of the prison administration while documenting the scope of criminal activities that extended far beyond simple inmate-on-inmate violence and drug dealing. "I appreciate the trust, Tank," David replied, his gratitude genuine despite the deceptive circumstances, "and I promise you won't regret bringing me into your inner circle." His response seemed to satisfy Tank's ego while positioning David to gather the kind of evidence that would ultimately bring down not just Tank's organization but the entire network of corruption that had allowed it to flourish within the supposedly secure environment of a federal correctional facility. The first crack in David's carefully constructed cover identity appeared during a violent confrontation when Tank's crew attempted to sexually assault a young first-time offender, triggering combat instincts that David struggled to suppress while maintaining his facade of weakness and compliance. Hold him down while I show this college boy what happens to pretty faces who think they're too good to pay their debts, Tank commanded as he advanced on the terrified victim. But David's trained reflexes responded faster than his conscious mind could stop them. Wait, David interjected, stepping between Tank and his intended victim with fluid movement that briefly revealed military bearing before he caught himself and resumed his submissive posture. Maybe there's another way to handle this that doesn't risk bringing the guards down on us. His intervention was disguised as concern for Tank's safety rather than protection of the victim. But the speed and confidence of his movement had been too natural to completely hide his true capabilities. Miller, you got some kind of problem with how I run my business? Tank demanded suspiciously, his small brain noting something different about David's behavior even if he couldn't articulate exactly what had changed. No problem at all, Tank, David replied quickly. I just don't want anything to happen that might complicate your operations or bring unwanted attention from the administration. His explanation seemed to satisfy Tank's paranoia while buying time for the young victim to escape, but several of Tank's more observant lieutenants had noticed the military precision of David's movement and began watching him more carefully. The physical conditioning that David maintained through clandestine exercise routines began to attract attention when other inmates noticed that the supposedly weak newcomer possessed muscle definition and endurance that contradicted his submissive persona and claimed background as a white-collar criminal. Miller, for a guy who supposedly worked in an office, you're in pretty good shape, observed Tommy Razor Martinez, one of Tank's more intelligent enforcers who had survived on the streets by being suspicious of everyone and everything that seemed too convenient or coincidental. Most accountants I know can't do 50 push-ups without collapsing, but you've been cranking them out every morning like you're training for something. The observation forced David to improvise explanations that wouldn't blow his cover while deflecting suspicion about his true background and current mission objectives. I've always been into fitness, David replied casually, and being locked up gives me plenty of time to work out since I don't have much else to do besides read and stay out of trouble. His explanation was plausible but didn't completely satisfy Razor's curiosity about inconsistencies between David's claimed background and his observed behavior patterns that suggested military or law enforcement training rather than civilian office work. The combat skills that David had acquired during 3 combat deployments became increasingly difficult to suppress when Tank's organization escalated their violence and began targeting weaker inmates for more serious crimes including rape, severe assault, and even murder conspiracies that crossed legal lines David couldn't ignore. Miller, tomorrow we're going to make an example of that snitch Rodriguez, Tank announced during a planning session. And I want you to help us send a message that will keep other inmates from getting ideas about cooperating with the investigators who've been sniffing around lately. The assignment to participate in what was clearly planned as a murder forced David to confront the limits of his undercover role and the moral compromises that deep cover assignments sometimes required from agents and soldiers who had sworn oaths to protect innocent people. Tank, maybe we should think about the consequences of escalating things that far, David suggested carefully. Murder brings federal investigators and turns up heat that could expose our other operations to scrutiny we might not be able to handle. His tactical analysis was disguised as concern for Tank's organization, but his real motivation was preventing a murder while protecting his mission and gathering additional evidence about the scope of criminal activities within the prison's unofficial power structure. The behavioral analysis training that David had received during his preparation for the undercover assignment helped him recognize that Tank's increasing paranoia and violence were symptoms of steroid abuse and psychological instability that made the crime boss increasingly dangerous and unpredictable. Something's not right about Miller, Tank confided to his closest lieutenant during what he thought was a private conversation. He's too smart, too calm, too ready with suggestions about how to avoid getting caught. Real criminals don't think that tactically unless they've had training or experience that goes beyond normal street knowledge. His suspicions were based on instincts rather than concrete evidence, but David realized that his cover was beginning to deteriorate under the scrutiny of people who had survived by being suspicious of anything that seemed out of place in their violent world. The challenge was maintaining his facade long enough to gather the evidence needed to complete his mission while avoiding the kind of confrontation that would force him to reveal his true capabilities and blow years of careful preparation and infiltration efforts. "Boss, you want me to do some digging into Miller's background?" asked Johnson, Tank's most loyal enforcer. "I got contacts who can check whether his story holds up under serious investigation." The offer to investigate David's cover identity represented a serious threat that required immediate countermeasures to protect his mission and possibly his life if Tank discovered that he had been infiltrated by federal law enforcement. The psychological pressure of maintaining his cover while witnessing increasingly serious crimes began to affect David's mental health and decision-making abilities. As his military training to protect innocent people conflicted with his mission requirements to gather evidence without interfering in criminal activities. "Miller, I want you to help us grab that kid Morrison from protective custody," Tank ordered during their 4th week together. "We got buyers who'll pay premium prices for fresh meat, and Morrison's got the kind of pretty face that commands top dollar in our Special Services Division." The assignment to participate in human trafficking forced David to confront the reality that some crimes couldn't be allowed to continue regardless of mission objectives or cover identity preservation requirements. His military oath and personal moral code demanded action to protect the victim, even if intervention meant sacrificing months of careful intelligence gathering and potentially compromising a federal investigation that could take down dozens of criminals and corrupt officials. "Tank, that's going to bring a lot of heat from the FBI task force that's been investigating human trafficking cases," David warned, using his knowledge of federal law enforcement procedures to argue against the planned crime while buying time to develop alternative approaches that might protect the victim without completely blowing his cover identity. The breaking point in David's undercover assignment arrived when Tank, convinced that David was either a federal agent or rival gang member trying to infiltrate his organization, decided to test his loyalty through a brutal initiation ritual that would force him to commit murder while being recorded for blackmail purposes. "Miller, tomorrow you're going to kill Rodriguez while the cameras are rolling," Tank announced with finality that left no room for negotiation or delay. "And after that you'll be blood bonded to our organization with evidence that ensures your loyalty and silence for life." The ultimatum represented the end of David's ability to maintain his cover while avoiding direct participation in murder, forcing him to choose between completing his mission and maintaining the moral and legal standards that defined his identity as a soldier and human being. "Tank, are you sure that's the best way to handle the Rodriguez situation?" David asked, desperately seeking alternatives that might preserve his cover while preventing murder. "Maybe there are other ways to deal with snitches that don't create the kind of evidence that could be used against us later." His attempt to dissuade Tank from the planned murder was transparent enough to confirm the crime boss's suspicions about his true identity and loyalties, setting up the confrontation that would either end David's mission or Tank's criminal empire, depending on who proved more skilled at violence and survival in the brutal environment where they were about to face off against each other. The moment of truth arrived when Tank cornered David in the prison laundry room, surrounded by his most loyal enforcers and armed with improvised weapons that could kill or seriously injure someone who wasn't prepared to defend himself with maximum force and efficiency. "I don't know if you're a cop, a fed, or just some do-gooder who thinks he can infiltrate my organization," Tank snarled as he brandished a sharpened metal strip that had been fashioned into a deadly blade. "But your little game ends right here, right now, and your death is going to send a message to anyone else who thinks they can fuck with Tank Rodriguez." The threat was accompanied by the advance of 6 armed inmates who had positioned themselves to prevent escape while ensuring that David's death would appear to be the result of gang violence rather than the execution of an undercover agent whose identity had been compromised. David's response would determine not only his own survival but the fate of future victims and the success of a federal investigation that had taken years to develop. "Tank, I think there's been a misunderstanding here. I'm not whoever you think I am, and I definitely don't want any trouble with you or your organization." His words were carefully chosen to buy time while he assessed threats and calculated the tactical approach that would give him the best chance of survival against multiple armed opponents in a confined space where civilian casualties were possible if the confrontation escalated beyond what the prison's security systems could contain or control. The transformation from submissive inmate to lethal combatant happened so quickly that Tank's enforcers barely had time to process what they were seeing before David had disarmed 2 of them and positioned himself with tactical advantages that demonstrated training far beyond anything a civilian accountant should possess. "You want to dance, Tank," David said, his voice carrying the cold confidence of someone who had survived countless life-or-death situations in far more dangerous environments than a prison laundry room. "Then let's dance. But I should warn you that I'm not the same man you thought you were dealing with." His military bearing emerged fully as he moved with fluid precision that spoke of years of combat training and actual battlefield experience, his previous submissive posture replaced by the alert readiness of a professional warrior who had been forced to abandon his cover and fight for survival. "What the fuck?" Tank stammered. momentarily confused by the complete transformation of someone he had categorized as weak prey into an obvious predator whose capabilities exceeded anything he had encountered during his years of prison violence and street warfare. "You ain't no accountant, Miller. Who the hell are you really?" The question carried undertones of fear as Tank began to realize that he had seriously underestimated his opponent and might have triggered a confrontation that he wasn't equipped to win through normal intimidation and brute force tactics. The combat skills that David unleashed were the product of intensive Army Ranger training combined with real-world experience in Afghanistan, where split-second decisions and overwhelming violence had meant the difference between survival and death on countless occasions. "I'm Staff Sergeant David Chen, United States Army Rangers," David announced as he systematically disabled Tank's enforcers using techniques that were designed to neutralize threats quickly and efficiently. "And I've been gathering evidence of your criminal organization for the past month on behalf of a federal task force that's about to bring down this entire corruption network." His revelation of his true identity was accompanied by demonstrations of hand-to-hand combat skills that left several of Tank's men unconscious or incapacitated, while the crime boss himself began backing toward the laundry room exit in search of escape routes or additional weapons that might give him advantages in a fight he was clearly losing. "You're a fucking Fed!" Tank screamed, his voice cracking with panic as he realized that his paranoid suspicions had been correct and that his organization had been compromised by someone with the skills and authority to destroy everything he had built during his years of controlling the prison's criminal economy. "You set me up. You recorded everything." The accusation was accurate, but Tank's outrage seemed misplaced given the countless crimes he had committed and the innocent people he had victimized during his reign of terror within the correctional facility. The backup devices and emergency protocols that David activated during the confrontation ensured that federal agents positioned outside the prison would respond immediately to rescue him and secure the evidence he had gathered during his month of undercover work. "Federal agents are already moving to secure this facility," David informed Tank as he maintained tactical superiority despite being outnumbered. "And everything you've said and done during the past month has been recorded and transmitted to prosecutors who are preparing charges that will put you away for life without possibility of parole." His revelation that Tank's entire criminal empire had been documented and that arrests were imminent seemed to break the crime boss's psychological resistance as the reality of his situation became clear. "This can end easy or hard, Tank," David continued. "But either way, it ends today. You can surrender peacefully and maybe avoid additional charges, or you can keep fighting and add assaulting a federal agent to your list of crimes." The choice David offered was tactical psychology designed to encourage surrender while maintaining pressure that would prevent Tank from attempting desperate measures that might endanger innocent inmates or prison staff who had no involvement in the criminal organization's activities. The psychological breakdown that Tank experienced when confronted with the reality of his exposure and impending arrest revealed the fundamental cowardice that had always hidden behind his intimidation tactics and violence against weaker victims. "I built this empire from nothing," Tank whimpered as federal agents flooded into the prison and began making arrests based on the evidence that David had gathered. "And now some soldier boy in disguise is going to destroy everything I worked for?" His self-pity ignored the countless lives he had ruined and the victims he had terrorized during his years of criminal activity, focusing instead on his own losses rather than the justice that was finally being served to people who had suffered under his brutal regime. "You worked for the suffering and exploitation of innocent people," David replied without sympathy. "And now you're going to pay the price for choosing to be a predator instead of finding legitimate ways to build a life and career." His moral judgment reflected the values that had motivated his willingness to undertake a dangerous undercover mission that could have cost him his life if Tank had discovered his identity earlier or responded more violently to the revelation of his true purpose and capabilities. The arrest operation that followed David's blown cover involved dozens of federal agents who had been prepared for weeks to move quickly once his intelligence gathering was complete or his safety was compromised by discovery of his true identity. "Tank Rodriguez, you're under arrest for racketeering, drug trafficking, human trafficking, assault, murder conspiracy, and corruption of federal corrections officers," announced Special Agent Sarah Martinez as she read the charges that had been developed based on David's recorded evidence and testimony. "You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly advise you to use it because anything you say will be used against you in federal court." The formal arrest procedures provided a stark contrast to Tank's informal rule of terror, as constitutional protections and legal processes replaced the arbitrary violence and intimidation that had characterized his approach to resolving conflicts and maintaining control over people he considered inferior or threatening to his interests. "This ain't over, Chen," Tank shouted as he was led away in restraints. "I got connections on the outside who don't forget snitches and feds who cross the line." His threats reflected the desperation of someone whose power had been completely stripped away, leaving only empty bluster and wishful thinking about revenge that would never materialize given the scope of the federal case being built against his organization. The debriefing process that David underwent following his extraction from the prison revealed the full scope of the intelligence he had gathered and the impact his mission would have on federal prosecutions of corruption and organized crime throughout the correctional system. "Sergeant Chen, your work over the past month has provided evidence for over 40 federal indictments and will likely result in the prosecution of the largest prison corruption case in Department of Justice history," reported Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh during the initial debriefing session, including charges against prison administrators, guards, and outside contacts who facilitated Tank's criminal organization. The scope of the case that David's undercover work had enabled demonstrated the value of his sacrifice, and the risks he had taken to gather evidence that conventional investigation methods could never have obtained. "Your recordings and testimony will be crucial for securing convictions against defendants who might otherwise escape justice due to witness intimidation and lack of physical evidence," continued Attorney Walsh, "and the precedent this case establishes will help prosecutors nationwide address similar corruption networks in other correctional facilities." The broader implications of David's mission extended far beyond Tank's individual case to encompass systemic reforms that would protect future inmates from the kind of exploitation and violence that had characterized Tank's criminal empire. The recognition that David received for his undercover work included both military commendations and federal law enforcement awards that acknowledged the unique contribution his mission had made to justice and corrections reform. Staff Sergeant Chen's willingness to undertake this dangerous assignment and his professional execution of intelligence gathering under extreme circumstances represent the highest standards of military service and federal law enforcement cooperation, read the citation that accompanied his Medal of Valor. His courage and dedication resulted in the dismantling of a criminal organization that had terrorized innocent people for years while corrupting the institutions designed to protect society from predators and criminals. The formal recognition provided some measure of validation for the psychological costs David had endured during his month of witnessing crimes he couldn't prevent and maintaining a false identity that contradicted his core values and military training. "The evidence Sergeant Chen gathered will protect countless future inmates from exploitation and violence," noted FBI Director James Morrison during the award ceremony, "and his service demonstrates how military and civilian law enforcement can work together to address threats that transcend traditional jurisdictional boundaries and require specialized skills and courage to investigate effectively." The acknowledgement of David's contribution highlighted the importance of unconventional approaches to law enforcement challenges that couldn't be addressed through standard investigative techniques or traditional undercover operations. The trial proceedings that resulted from David's undercover work created a legal spectacle that exposed the depth of corruption within the prison system while providing justice for countless victims who had suffered under Tank's brutal regime. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Prosecutor Jennifer Walsh declared during her opening statement, "the evidence you will hear over the next several weeks will shock you with its revelations about systematic criminal activity that turned a federal correctional facility into a private kingdom ruled by violence, fear, and exploitation." The recordings that David had secretly made provided prosecutors with unprecedented documentation of criminal conversations and planning sessions that would have been impossible to obtain through traditional surveillance methods. Tank's voice could be heard clearly directing drug trafficking operations, ordering violent assaults, planning sexual exploitation of vulnerable inmates, and negotiating with corrupt prison officials who facilitated his criminal enterprise in exchange for financial kickbacks and other benefits. The defendant believed he was untouchable because he had corrupted the very system designed to contain him, Walsh continued. But Staff Sergeant David Chen's heroic undercover work has given us the evidence needed to hold him accountable for years of predatory behavior and criminal activity. The prosecution's case was strengthened immeasurably by David's first-hand testimony about the crimes he had witnessed and the systematic nature of Tank's organization, providing context and credibility that transformed recorded evidence into a compelling narrative of justice delayed but finally delivered. The defense strategy employed by Tank's legal team attempted to discredit David's testimony by arguing that his undercover methods were entrapment and that his military training made him an unreliable witness who had provoked confrontations rather than simply observing criminal activity. Members of the jury, My client was targeted by a highly trained military operative who infiltrated the prison under false pretenses and systematically gathered information that may have been obtained through illegal surveillance and entrapment techniques, argued defense attorney Michael Torres during his opening statement. Staff Sergeant Chen was not an innocent observer but an active participant who may have encouraged or facilitated the very crimes he now claims to have witnessed. The defense argument ignored the extensive legal oversight and judicial approval that had been required for David's undercover mission, as well as the clear evidence that Tank's criminal organization had been operating for years before David's arrival and would have continued regardless of his presence. The prosecution wants you to believe that my client was some kind of criminal mastermind, Torres continued. But the evidence will show that he was manipulated by a trained intelligence operative who used psychological tactics and military expertise to create situations that could be used against him in court. The defense's attempts to portray Tank as a victim of sophisticated manipulation failed to address the overwhelming evidence of his voluntary criminal activity and the testimony of numerous witnesses who confirmed his reign of terror within the prison system. The victim impact statements that were presented during Tank's sentencing hearing provided heartbreaking testimony about the human cost of his criminal organization and the lasting trauma experienced by inmates who had been subjected to his violence and exploitation. Tank Rodriguez destroyed my life and the lives of countless other men who just wanted to serve their sentences and return to their families, testified former inmate Michael Patterson, whose sexual assault and subsequent infection with HIV had been orchestrated by Tank's organization as punishment for refusing to participate in drug trafficking activities. He created a system where the strong preyed on the weak without any consideration for human dignity or basic decency, and his crimes went far beyond anything the courts had sentenced us to endure. The testimony revealed that Tank's organization had effectively created additional punishments that went far beyond what the justice system had intended, turning prison sentences into ongoing torture for victims who had no recourse or protection from systematic abuse. I lived in constant fear for 2 years, continued another victim, never knowing when Tank's crew would decide I hadn't paid enough or shown sufficient respect, never able to sleep without worrying about being attacked or forced to do things that violated everything I believed about human dignity and moral behavior. The cumulative impact of these testimonies created a record of suffering that exceeded what most people could imagine, demonstrating how Tank's criminal enterprise had perverted the correctional system's mission of rehabilitation and public safety into a mechanism for perpetuating cruelty and exploitation. The sentencing phase of Tank's trial provided an opportunity for the judge to address not only his specific crimes but the broader implications of prison corruption and the need for systemic reforms that would prevent similar organizations from developing in other correctional facilities. Mr. Rodriguez, your crimes represent more than just individual acts of violence and exploitation, declared Federal Judge Patricia Williams during the sentencing hearing. They represent a systematic corruption of institutions that society depends upon to maintain justice and public safety. The judge's comments acknowledged that Tank's case had implications beyond his personal accountability, requiring institutional changes that would address the conditions that had allowed his criminal organization to flourish for years without detection or intervention. The evidence presented in this case reveals failures at every level of the correctional system, from inadequate oversight of inmate activities to corruption among staff members who were supposed to maintain security and prevent exactly the kind of predatory behavior that characterized your organization, Judge Williams continued. Your sentence must reflect not only punishment for your crimes but also deterrence that will discourage others from attempting similar corruption of our justice system. The judicial recognition of systemic problems highlighted the broader significance of David's undercover work in exposing institutional failures that required comprehensive reform rather than just individual prosecutions. The final sentencing that Judge Williams imposed on Tank reflected the severity of his crimes and the aggravating factors that had made his organization particularly harmful to victims and damaging to public confidence in the correctional system. Marcus Rodriguez, this court sentences you to life imprisonment without possibility of parole on the racketeering charges, plus consecutive sentences totaling an additional 45 years for drug trafficking, human trafficking, and assault charges, Judge Williams announced to a packed courtroom that included many of Tank's victims and David Chen in his military dress uniform. Your crimes were not committed in a moment of passion or desperation, but were the result of a calculated decision to build a criminal empire that victimized vulnerable people who had no ability to escape or seek help from authorities who should have protected them. The sentence effectively ensured that Tank would never again have the opportunity to harm innocent people or corrupt institutional systems designed to serve public safety and rehabilitation goals. Additionally, this court is recommending that the Bureau of Prisons implement comprehensive reforms based on the evidence revealed during this trial, including enhanced monitoring of inmate activities, improved screening of correctional staff, and establishment of independent oversight mechanisms that can detect and prevent the kind of systematic corruption that allowed your organization to operate undetected for so many years. The judge's recommendations for institutional reform reflected recognition that Tank's case represented systemic problems that required comprehensive solutions rather than just individual accountability measures. The long-term impact of David's undercover mission extended far beyond Tank's individual prosecution to encompass nationwide reforms in correctional practices and federal law enforcement approaches to prison corruption and organized crime. Sergeant Chen's work has become a model for future undercover operations in correctional settings, reported FBI Assistant Director Sarah Martinez during a press conference following Tank's sentencing. And the intelligence gathering techniques he employed have been incorporated into training programs for agents who may face similar assignments in other facilities where corruption is suspected. The recognition of David's contribution highlighted how individual acts of courage and sacrifice could catalyze broader institutional changes that protected countless future victims from similar exploitation and abuse. The Tank Rodriguez case has also led to legislation requiring enhanced oversight of federal correctional facilities and mandatory reporting procedures that will make it more difficult for similar criminal organizations to operate undetected, continued Director Martinez. Staff Sergeant Chen's willingness to risk his life gathering evidence has resulted in systemic changes that will protect inmates and maintain public confidence in our correctional institutions for years to come. The lasting legacy of David's mission demonstrated how targeted law enforcement operations could address not just individual crimes but institutional failures that enabled systematic abuse and corruption to flourish without adequate oversight or accountability. The personal cost that David experienced as a result of his undercover work included ongoing psychological challenges related to witnessing crimes he couldn't prevent and maintaining a false identity that conflicted with his core values and military training. The month I spent undercover was one of the most difficult periods of my military career, David reflected during an interview with military journalists, because I had to watch innocent people suffer while maintaining my cover and gathering evidence that would eventually help them, but couldn't provide immediate protection or intervention. His honest acknowledgement of the emotional toll highlighted the sacrifice that undercover work required from agents and soldiers who were willing to endure personal trauma in service of broader justice and public safety goals. There were times when I questioned whether the mission was worth the price, especially when I witnessed violence against people who reminded me of my own family members or fellow soldiers, David continued. But seeing Tank's conviction and knowing that future inmates will be protected by the reforms that resulted from this case helps me understand that sometimes the greatest service requires accepting personal costs that seem overwhelming in the moment but prove worthwhile when justice is finally served. The recognition of his sacrifice and its long-term impact provided some measure of healing for the psychological wounds that David had endured during his month of living a lie while surrounded by violence and corruption that challenged his faith in human decency and institutional justice. The transformation from hunter to hunted happened so explosively that Tank's enforcers barely comprehended they were facing a trained killer until 3 of them were already unconscious on the laundry room floor. Their improvised weapons useless against someone who had been taught to neutralize multiple armed opponents in confined spaces. "You picked the wrong soldier to fuck with, Tank," David snarled as he disarmed the 4th attacker with a move that snapped the man's wrist with an audible crack, his military training taking over completely as months of suppressed instincts erupted in a display of lethal efficiency that left no doubt about his true capabilities. "I've killed actual terrorists with my bare hands in Afghanistan. And you're just another predator who's about to learn what happens when you threaten someone who's sworn an oath to protect innocent people." The cold fury in David's voice carried the authority of someone who had faced death in real combat and emerged victorious, making Tank's prison reputation for violence seem like amateur posturing compared to the professional lethality now focused entirely on his destruction. "Jesus Christ," gasped Tommy Razor, the only enforcer still standing. "He's fucking military. Tank, we need to get out of here right now." His panicked warning came too late as David advanced with the methodical precision of someone executing a tactical operation, each movement calculated to maximize damage while minimizing his own exposure to counterattack. The systematic dismantling of Tank's crew continued as David demonstrated why Army Rangers were considered among the world's most elite soldiers. His combat techniques honed through years of fighting enemies far more dangerous than prison bullies armed with sharpened metal. "I've been documenting every crime you've committed for the past month," David announced as he rendered Tank's final enforcer unconscious with a sleeper hold that cut off blood flow to the brain. Every drug deal, every assault, every rape you ordered, every bribe you paid to corrupt guards. It's all recorded and transmitted to federal prosecutors who are probably already preparing arrest warrants. His revelation that Tank's entire criminal empire had been infiltrated and documented sent shockwaves through the crime boss's already fractured confidence, as the reality of his situation became undeniably clear. "You're not just looking at more prison time, Tank," David continued as he positioned himself between the crime boss and the only exit. "You're looking at federal charges that carry life sentences without parole, and that's assuming you survive long enough to face trial." The threat was delivered with the matter-of-fact tone that soldiers used when describing tactical realities, making it clear that Tank's immediate survival depended entirely on David's professional restraint rather than any inability to kill him where he stood. The psychological collapse that followed Tank's realization that he had been completely outmaneuvered was as spectacular as his physical defeat, revealing the fundamental cowardice that had always hidden behind his intimidation tactics and violence against defenseless victims. "This ain't possible," Tank whimpered as he backed against the laundry room wall, his massive frame somehow diminished by the presence of someone whose quiet confidence radiated genuine danger rather than manufactured threats. "You can't be some kind of super soldier spy bullshit. You're just Miller, the accountant who cleans my cell and pays protection money." His desperate denial of reality reflected an inability to accept that he had been systematically deceived and defeated by someone he had categorized as prey rather than predator. Staff Sergeant David Chen, 75th Ranger Regiment, 3 combat deployments. David recited his credentials with military precision. "And for the past month I've been gathering evidence that's going to destroy everything you've built here while ensuring that you never harm another innocent person for the rest of your miserable life." The formal introduction carried implications that made Tank's situation hopeless, as federal law enforcement backing combined with military training created a combination that his criminal organization had no resources to counter or escape. The sound of approaching sirens and the metallic clang of security doors being unlocked announced the arrival of federal agents who had been waiting for David's signal to move in and secure the facility based on the evidence he had gathered during his undercover operation. Federal agents. "Everyone on the ground now," shouted Special Agent Sarah Martinez as armed FBI personnel flooded into the laundry room, their tactical gear and professional coordination making Tank's amateur criminal organization look pathetic by comparison. "Marcus Rodriguez, you're under arrest for racketeering, drug trafficking, human trafficking, conspiracy, assault, and corruption of federal officers." Agent Martinez continued as she read the charges that had been carefully prepared based on David's recorded evidence and witness testimony. Tank's arrest was just the beginning of a coordinated operation that would sweep through the entire prison, apprehending corrupt guards, compromised administrators, and outside contacts who had facilitated the criminal network that David's mission had exposed. "Sergeant Chen, excellent work," Agent Martinez said as she surveyed the unconscious enforcers scattered around the laundry room. "Your intelligence gathering has given us everything we need to dismantle this entire operation and ensure that these predators never hurt anyone again." The professional acknowledgement of David's contribution highlighted the success of a mission that had required extraordinary courage and sacrifice to complete. The immediate aftermath of Tank's arrest created chaos throughout the prison as inmates struggled to understand how their unofficial ruler had been so completely defeated and exposed, while honest guards and administrators began the process of identifying and removing corrupt personnel who had enabled the criminal organization to flourish. "How the fuck did this happen?" demanded Johnson, Tank's lieutenant, as he was led away in restraints. Miller was just some weak fish who cleaned cells and ran errands. He couldn't have been undercover law enforcement. His bewilderment reflected the systematic deception that David had maintained throughout his month of infiltration, convincing even sophisticated criminals that he posed no threat to their operations. "Sergeant Chen's performance was flawless," observed FBI Supervisor James Morrison as he reviewed the evidence that David's mission had produced. He maintained his cover identity under extreme pressure while gathering intelligence that will result in the largest prison corruption prosecution in Department of Justice history. The scope of the case that David's work had enabled would ultimately encompass dozens of defendants and require years of litigation to fully resolve. But the immediate impact was the restoration of legitimate authority within a facility that had been effectively controlled by criminal elements for years. The transformation of David from undercover operative back to military personnel was both relief and adjustment challenge, as he struggled to process the psychological impact of spending a month witnessing crimes against innocent people while being unable to intervene immediately to protect victims. "The hardest part wasn't maintaining my cover or dealing with physical threats," David explained during his debriefing with military and FBI personnel. "It was watching Tank's organization hurt people and knowing that I had to let some crimes continue in order to gather the evidence needed to stop all future crimes." His honest acknowledgement of the moral complexity involved in undercover work highlighted the sacrifice that such missions required from agents and soldiers who were trained to protect innocent people but sometimes had to delay intervention in order to achieve broader justice goals. "There were moments when I questioned whether the mission was worth the human cost," David continued. "Especially when I witnessed sexual assaults and other violence that I could have prevented if I had blown my cover and intervened directly." The psychological burden of these decisions would require ongoing counseling and support as David readjusted to normal military duties and processed the trauma of his undercover experience. The lasting impact of David's mission extended far beyond Tank's individual prosecution to encompass comprehensive reforms in federal correctional practices and enhanced cooperation between military and civilian law enforcement agencies facing complex infiltration challenges. Sergeant Chen's work has established new protocols for undercover operations in correctional settings, reported Deputy Attorney General Patricia Williams during a press conference announcing the indictments resulting from David's intelligence gathering. "And his methods will be studied and adapted for similar missions in other facilities where organized crime has compromised institutional security and inmate safety." The recognition of David's contribution highlighted how individual acts of courage could catalyze systemic changes that protected countless future victims from similar exploitation and abuse. The evidence gathered during this operation has also led to congressional hearings on prison oversight and new legislation requiring enhanced monitoring of correctional facilities to prevent the kind of systematic corruption that allowed Tank Rodriguez's organization to operate undetected for so many years, continued Deputy Attorney General Williams. The broader implications of David's mission demonstrated how targeted law enforcement operations could address not just individual crimes but institutional failures that enabled predatory behavior to flourish without adequate oversight or accountability. The personal recognition that David received for his undercover work included both military commendations and federal law enforcement awards that acknowledged the unique contribution his mission had made to justice and public safety, though he remained characteristically humble about his role in the operation's success. "I was just doing my job," David said during the ceremony where he received the Medal of Valor. "And any soldier in my position would have made the same choices and taken the same risks to protect innocent people and uphold the rule of law." His modest response reflected military values that emphasized duty and service over personal recognition, while acknowledging the teamwork and institutional support that had made his mission possible. Sergeant Chen's willingness to undertake this dangerous assignment represents the highest traditions of military service and demonstrates how our armed forces can contribute to domestic security challenges that require specialized skills and extraordinary courage, declared General Robert Hayes during the award presentation. His success has not only brought criminals to justice but has also strengthened the partnership between military and civilian law enforcement agencies that will be crucial for addressing future threats to public safety and institutional integrity. The recognition of David's achievement highlighted the value of military training and discipline in addressing complex law enforcement challenges that required both physical courage and psychological resilience to complete successfully. The federal courthouse steps buzzed with media activity as Tank Rodriguez, now wearing an orange jumpsuit instead of prison gray, was led in shackles to face sentencing for the 37 felony counts that David's evidence had made possible to prove beyond reasonable doubt. "The defendant's reign of terror is finally over," announced U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh to the gathered reporters, "and the victims of his criminal organization can finally begin to heal knowing that justice has been served." Tank's conviction on all counts had surprised no one who had heard the recorded evidence of his crimes, but the life sentence without possibility of parole sent a clear message that systematic prison corruption would be met with the full force of federal law enforcement. David Chen, now back in his army dress uniform, watched from the courthouse steps as the man who had once threatened to break him was led away to spend the rest of his life in a maximum security facility where his reputation and connections would provide no protection from the kind of justice that finally balanced the scales for his countless victims. The ripple effects of David's mission continued to transform correctional practices nationwide as the reforms implemented at Riverside became models for preventing similar corruption in other facilities. Tank's former victims, now protected by enhanced oversight and witness protection programs, began the long process of rebuilding their lives with the knowledge that their tormentor would never again have the power to hurt them or anyone else. And somewhere in Afghanistan, where David had returned for his 4th combat deployment, the skills and courage that had brought down a prison empire were once again being used to protect innocent people and uphold the values that made his sacrifice worthwhile. The quiet accountant who had endured a month of hell to gather evidence was gone, replaced by the soldier whose true mission, protecting others regardless of personal cost, continued in new theaters where courage and dedication were needed to stand against those who preyed upon the vulnerable and innocent.